Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that all the water in your country has turned to blood. It's not a metaphor, it's not a figure of speech. You turn on the faucet, blood. You go to the river, blood. You dig a well, blood. Exodus says the fish died, the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink. We are talking about an entire nation, between 3 and 4 million people, without a single drop of clean water. Now multiply that, because that was only the first of 10 consecutive plagues that fell upon Egypt for weeks, possibly months, without interval, without truce, without mercy, each one worse than the last. Each one attacking something different, the water, the air, the skin, the animals, the sky, and in the end the lives of their own children. But what no one tells you is what it was like to live through this day by day. How did an Egyptian mother feed her children when the animals were dead and the crops had been destroyed by hail? How did a farmer protect his livestock when a supernatural disease killed every animal he owned? What happened to the economy, to trade, to social order, when plague after plague dismantled everything that sustained the most powerful civilization of the ancient world? To understand what happened, you first need to understand what Egypt was before the plagues began. We are somewhere between 1450 and 1250 BC. The exact dating is debated, but the setting is not. Egypt was the absolute superpower of the ancient world. While most of the surrounding peoples lived in tents and mud villages, Egypt had cities with polished stone temples that gleamed under the sun, palaces with alabaster floors, irrigation canals that turned the desert into fertile land, and a bureaucratic machine so sophisticated that it recorded every bag of grain produced in every corner of the kingdom. The Nile River was the heart of everything. It is no exaggeration to say that without the Nile, Egypt simply did not exist. It provided drinking water, irrigated the crops, transported goods, fed the fish that were the basic protein of the Egyptian diet, and fertilized the land with its annual floods. The Nile was not just a river, it was a god. The Egyptians worshipped Hapi, the deity of the flood, and offered sacrifices on the banks to ensure the waters remained generous. All theology, all economy, and all daily life revolved around that river, and that was exactly where God decided to start. Moses and Aaron presented themselves before Pharaoh with a simple message: "Let my people go." Pharaoh laughed, literally. Exodus 5:2 records his response: "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." This arrogance cost him dearly, because what came next was not just a punishment, it was a surgical deconstruction of everything the Egyptians believed in, worshipped, and depended on. The first plague. Aaron extends the staff over the Nile, and all the water in Egypt turns to blood. Not just the Nile. Exodus is specific. The waters of Egypt, their rivers, their canals, their ponds, and all their reservoirs. Even the water stored in wooden and stone vessels inside the houses turned to blood. Think about the impact of this on daily life. The average Egyptian woke up before sunrise, washed their face with water from the Nile, prepared a meal of bread and beer, yes, beer, which was the basic drink of Egypt, made with Nile water fermented with barley, and went to work in the fields or on construction sites. Suddenly, none of that works. There is no water to drink, no water to cook with, no water to make beer, no water to irrigate, no water to wash. The fish died. Exodus says the river stank. Imagine the stench of millions of rotting fish along hundreds of miles of river under the scorching sun of the Egyptian desert. And here enters a detail that almost no one notices. The text says, the plague lasted 7 days. 7 days. It seems like a short time, but think carefully. The human body survives at most 3 days without water under normal conditions. In the heat of Egypt, even less. Exodus gives a crucial clue. And all the Egyptians dug around the river for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the river. They were desperate. They dug holes in the sand of the banks, hoping that the water filtered through the soil would emerge clean. Some scholars suggest that this filtered water was partially potable, enough to survive, but not enough to maintain normal life. Imagine an entire city, Thebes, Memphis, with tens of thousands of inhabitants, where everyone needs to dig holes in the ground to get gulps of muddy water. The lines must have been massive, conflicts over water must have been violent, and the poorest, slaves, manual laborers, the elderly, were likely the ones who suffered the most. Now, a question that almost no one asks, what about the Hebrews? Exodus does not explicitly say that Goshen, the region where the Israelites lived, was spared from the first plague. This distinction only clearly appears starting from the fourth plague in Exodus 8. So it is possible, and several biblical commentators argue this, that the Hebrews also suffered with the blood in the water. Moses had promised liberation, but the first thing that happened was that their water also turned to blood. Imagine the confusion. Imagine the doubt. This man said God would save us, and now we are without water just like the Egyptians. But the water was just the beginning, because what came next turned Egypt into a sensory nightmare that is hard to imagine. Second plague, frogs. And before you think of a half-dozen frogs hopping in the garden, read Exodus 8:3. The river will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom, and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs. In the ovens, in the bread kneading troughs, in your bed. We are not talking about a common infestation. We are talking about an invasion of such absurd proportions that you literally could not take a step without stepping on frogs. They were everywhere, inside shoes, inside food pots, inside folded clothes, under pillows. The sound was maddening. Millions of frogs croaking simultaneously, day and night without stopping. Have you ever heard the noise of a swamp at night? Now multiply that by 1,000 and put it inside your bedroom, 6 inches from your ear, while you try to sleep. And then comes the most disturbing detail. When the plague ended, the frogs did not go back to the river. They died. All of them, all at once. Exodus 8:13-14. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land stank. Heaps of dead frogs, decomposing, under the Egyptian sun. The stench must have been unbearable. And remember, the previous plague had killed all the fish and contaminated the water, so Egypt now had the residue of rotting fish in the river, plus the stench of mountains of dead frogs rotting in the fields, in the courtyards of the houses, in the city streets. The smell of death was omnipresent. There was nowhere to run from it. If all of this is impressing you, give this video a like right now so it reaches more people who have never heard this story told this way. Now think about the practical side. How do you cook when there are dead frogs inside your oven? How do you knead bread when frogs are rotting in your kneading trough? How do you feed your children when the entire food preparation chain is contaminated? The answer is, with extreme difficulty. The average Egyptian was now without clean water, without fish, with contaminated food, and surrounded by the stench of organic decomposition. And we are only on the second plague. There are 8 to go, third plague. And here things change in nature. Up until now, the plagues were disgusting, but they did not cause direct physical pain. That ended. Aaron strikes the staff on the ground, and all the dust of the land of Egypt turns into lice, or depending on the translation, gnats. The Hebrew uses the word kinim, which can refer to lice, gnats, or some kind of blood-sucking insect. Exodus says the kinim were on people and animals, on every living being. Imagine you are covered in bites. Your whole body itches. Your children cry all night because they cannot sleep from the itching. Your animals are driven mad, rubbing against walls, biting themselves, trying to get rid of something that is everywhere. There is no repellent. There is no insecticide. There is no way to escape. The insects are in the air, on your skin, in your hair, in your eyes. And here something fascinating happens in the biblical text. Pharaoh's magicians, who had managed to replicate the first two plagues with their secret arts, try to replicate this one and fail. Exodus 8:18-19. The magicians tried to produce lice by their secret arts, but they could not. And then they said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." The magicians themselves admitted that this was beyond any human or supernatural power they knew. But Pharaoh, he hardened his heart. Again. Then came the fourth plague, and with it a change that completely altered the dynamic of everything that was happening. Exodus 8:21-22 describes swarms. The Hebrew uses arov, which most translate as flies, but some scholars believe it was a mixture of various insects invading Egypt. But here is the crucial difference. For the first time, God makes a geographical distinction. Verse 22. On that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there. From that moment on, Egypt was divided into two worlds. On one side, the Egyptian territory, devastated, smelly, infested, suffering. On the other side, Goshen, untouched, clean, normal. Imagine being an Egyptian living near the border of Goshen. You look at your side, flies on everything, contaminated food, maddened animals. You look to the other side, a few miles away, Hebrews living as if nothing were happening. Green pasture, calm animals, clean air. How do you explain that? What kind of invisible border separates total destruction from absolute normalcy? This division created a social tension that the biblical text does not detail, but that is impossible to ignore. Think about the psychology. You are an ordinary Egyptian. You are not the pharaoh, not a priest, not a government official. You are a farmer, a craftsman, a fisherman, actually a former fisherman, because all the fish died in the first plague. You are suffering, your family is suffering, and you know exactly who is not suffering. The Hebrew slaves living right next door, the same slaves that your Pharaoh refuses to release. It is inevitable that a growing anger arose, not against the Hebrews, but against the Pharaoh. Let these people go once and for all, and end this. Exodus 10:7 confirms that this pressure existed when Pharaoh's own officials say, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" But by this point, Pharaoh was no longer just stubborn. He was caught in a trap of political religious ego. He was considered a living god. To yield to the pressure of a foreign god would be to admit that the god of the slaves was more powerful than he was. It would be the end of his divine legitimacy. It would be in practice to abdicate. And while Pharaoh refused to yield, Egypt continued to descend, deeper every day, each plague more devastating, because what came in the fifth plague did not attack humans. It attacked the entire economic base of Egyptian civilization. Fifth plague, pestilence on the animals. Exodus 9:3. The hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on the horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats. The key word here is terrible. It was not a disease that killed a few animals. Exodus 9:6 is categorical. All the livestock of the Egyptians died. All of them. Horses, which were the base of the Egyptian army. Donkeys, which were the cargo transport. Camels, essential for long-distance trade. Oxen, which pulled the plows and made agriculture work. Sheep, which provided wool, milk, and meat. Overnight, Egypt's economy collapsed. Without horses, there is no functional army. Without oxen, there is no way to plow the land. Without sheep, there is no meat, no milk, no wool for clothes. And remember, the fish had already died in the first plague. All of Egypt's animal protein simply disappeared. And again, Exodus 9:4, the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. The animals of the Hebrews survived, all of them. If you believe that this level of supernatural protection can only come from God, comment, God is sovereign. Now imagine the scene, the Egyptian fields covered with animal carcasses, the smell, once again, the smell. Remember that we already have layers of accumulated stench, dead fish, dead frogs, and now thousands, perhaps millions of dead animals rotting under the sun. The landscape of Egypt had been transformed into something resembling the end of the world. And the survivors, the Egyptians who were still trying to maintain some normalcy, now faced a real food crisis. With no animals for slaughter, no fish, and crops damaged by the previous plagues, hunger began to knock at the door. But hunger was not yet the worst of it, because the sixth plague brought something that no Egyptian could have predicted, and that transformed collective suffering into personal agony. Sixth plague, boils. Exodus 9:10-11 describes, they took soot from a furnace and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on people and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and on all the Egyptians. The magicians, the most spiritually powerful men in Egypt after the Pharaoh, could not even stand up. The Hebrew word used is shechin, the same word used to describe Job's boils. They were open, festering sores, painful to the touch, covering the entire body. Imagine an entire nation, millions of people, with their skin covered in open ulcers. No one can work. No one can sleep. Fathers cannot carry their children in their arms because the contact hurts too much. Mothers cannot breastfeed because the skin of their breasts is raw. The simple act of putting on clothes is torture. And remember what came before. These people were already dehydrated, malnourished, exhausted, covered in insect bites, breathing air contaminated by the stench of decomposition. The boils did not fall on healthy bodies. They fell on bodies already devastated. The vulnerability was total. Secondary infections must have been common. Without antibiotics, without modern medicine, an infected ulcer could kill. It is very likely that the sixth plague was the first to cause mass deaths among the population long before the 10th plague. Think about what is happening from the point of view of an ordinary Egyptian at this moment. In a matter of weeks, perhaps a few months, your life went from the comfort of the most advanced civilization in the world to something worse than any war. Your river turned to blood. Your house was invaded by frogs that then died and rotted in your furniture. Insects sucked your blood and that of your children to the point of madness. Swarms destroyed any remnant of normalcy. Your animals, your wealth, your transport, your food, all died in a single day. And now your body is covered in sores that burn, fester, and do not heal. You have lost everything, and Pharaoh still refuses to free the Hebrew slaves. But prepare yourself, because the 4 plagues that are still to come make all of this look like a prelude. What God was about to do to the sky of Egypt defies anything nature has ever produced in that region, and what happened on the final night changed not only Egypt, but the entire history of humanity. 7th plague, hail. But not just any hail. Forget everything you have ever seen in storms. Exodus 9:23-24 describes something that had never happened in the recorded history of Egypt. The Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Fire mixed with hail. Reread that. Stones of ice falling from the sky with fire burning between them. Modern meteorologists debate what this could be. Constant lightning in the midst of an extreme hailstorm. Some atmospheric volcanic phenomenon. The biblical text does not bother to explain the physics, it bothers to record the effect. And the effect was devastating. Exodus 9:25. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree, every herb, every tree. Everything that was exposed outdoors was destroyed. Think of it as an aerial bombardment. No outdoor shelter could withstand it. People who could not run inside stone structures died. Exodus records that God, before sending the plague, gave a warning. And this detail is extraordinary. He told Moses to warn that every man and animal out in the field without shelter would die. Verse 20. Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside. Some Egyptians were already listening. They were already taking the God of Israel seriously. But verse 21 adds, "But those who ignored the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the field, and they died." Now, let's look at the agricultural impact, because here begins the final collapse of Egypt's ability to feed its population. Exodus 9:31-32 is surprisingly specific. The flax and barley were destroyed, since the barley was in ear and the flax was in bloom. The wheat and spelt, however, were not destroyed because they ripen later. This is agronomic information that allows us even to place the plague on the calendar, probably between January and February, when barley is earing in Egypt. And it allows us to understand the calculation of destruction. Barley was the basic grain for making bread and beer, the two most fundamental foods of the Egyptian diet. Flax was the fiber used to manufacture practically all the clothing in Egypt, all medical bandages, all ship sails, all the fabric used in mummification. To destroy flax and barley was not just to destroy a crop. It was to destroy the textile industry, food production, medical capacity, and naval infrastructure all at once. The wheat and spelt survived because they were not yet ripe. There was still one last hope. If Egypt could protect this late crop, it could at least avoid total starvation. Keep this information in mind. It is crucial for understanding the next plague. And here I need you to stop and notice the pattern. Each plague was not random. Each one dismantled a specific layer of Egyptian civilization. The water, the basis of survival. The animals, the basis of the economy. The skin, the physical integrity of bodies. The crops, the ability to feed the people. And each plague was also a direct attack on a specific Egyptian god. The Nile was Hapi, the frogs were Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility. The pestilence on animals attacked Hathor, the cow-headed goddess, and Apis, the sacred bull. The boils challenged Isis, the goddess of healing. The hail with fire was an affront to Nut, the sky goddess, and Seth, the god of storms. God was not just punishing Egypt. He was systematically proving that every Egyptian deity was powerless. He was judging not just a pharaoh, he was judging an entire pantheon. Exodus confirms this directly. I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. And the pharaoh? At this point, his behavior follows a pattern that any psychologist would recognize. He yields in the moment of pain. I have sinned, the Lord is righteous, and goes back on it the instant the pressure relieves. Exodus 9:34-35. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. Each retreat was a sentence upon his own people. Each no meant another plague, and the next one was going to destroy the last hope of food that Egypt still had. 8th plague, locusts. Remember the wheat and spelt that survived the hail because they were not yet ripe? Those were exactly what the locusts came to devour. Exodus 10:14-15. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered all the ground until it was black. The ground turned black. There were so many insects that they blocked the sunlight. Anyone who has ever witnessed a locust swarm, and they still occur in Africa and the Middle East today, describes the same phenomenon. The sky turns dark, the sound is deafening, and in a matter of hours, not a green leaf is left. Nothing. A modern swarm of desert locusts can contain 80 million individuals per square kilometer and consume in one day the equivalent of food for 35,000 people. Now imagine a swarm Exodus describes as the largest that has ever existed, covering the entire territory of Egypt. Verse 15. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all the land of Egypt. Nothing green, not a leaf on any tree, not a plant in any field. Egypt, which weeks before was one of the most fertile lands of the ancient world, now looked like the surface of the moon, brown, dry, dead. I want you to mentally calculate what this means in terms of survival. The fish died in the first plague, the herds died in the fifth, the barley and flax were destroyed in the seventh, and now the wheat, the spelt, and all the remaining vegetation disappeared in the eighth. The entire food chain of Egypt was eliminated, all of it. A nation of millions of people now literally had no source of new food. What remained were the stocks in the granaries, and Egypt, being the power it was, likely had significant reserves. Royal granaries, temple storehouses, provincial warehouses. But these stocks had been planned to supplement production, not to replace it entirely. And with the transport animals dead, redistributing grain from central warehouses to remote populations was logistically almost impossible. The larger cities near the great granaries probably survived. But the rural villages, the more distant settlements, hunger must have already been a reality in those places, and at this point, something remarkable happened in the court. Pharaoh's servants, his advisors, his ministers, his officials, broke protocol and confronted Pharaoh directly. Exodus 10:7. Pharaoh's officials said to him, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Notice the tone, it's not a request. It's almost an accusation. Do you not yet realize? They were saying to Pharaoh's face that he was responsible for the destruction. It was insubordination. At any other moment in Egyptian history, anyone who spoke to the Pharaoh like that would have been executed. But the situation was so desperate that the normal rules no longer applied. The social fabric was tearing. Pharaoh tried to negotiate. He said the men could go, but the women and children would stay. Moses refused, and Pharaoh drove Moses out of his presence. And the locusts came. After the locusts, God sent a west wind that carried every locust into the Red Sea. Not a locust was left anywhere in Egypt, but the damage was done. The fields were bare, and what came in the ninth plague was perhaps the most terrifying of all. Not because of physical pain, not because of material destruction, but because of the pure psychological terror it caused. Ninth plague, darkness. Exodus 10:21-23. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt. Darkness that can be felt, darkness so dense you could physically feel it." It was not night. It was not an eclipse. It was not a sandstorm, although some naturalists have tried that explanation. The text is clear. For 3 days, no one could see anyone else. No one left their place. Total, absolute, impenetrable darkness for 72 consecutive hours. Try to process what this does to the human mind. You are sitting in your house. You cannot see your own hand in front of your face. You cannot see your children, although you hear their breathing right there beside you. You cannot light a torch and hear the ancient rabbis debate. But many commentators suggest that the darkness was supernatural in nature and that no flame could penetrate it. You are trapped, blind, disoriented, with no sense of time, because there is no difference between day and night. The fear is absolute. Every sound in the dark is a threat you cannot identify. Every silence is even worse. And in Egypt, This plague had a theological dimension that went straight to the heart of Egyptian identity. The supreme god of the Egyptian pantheon was Ra, the sun god. Pharaoh was considered the son of Ra, the incarnation of Ra on earth. All the legitimacy of the throne came from the sun. And now the sun had disappeared. For 3 days, Ra was dead, defeated, silenced. If the previous plagues had challenged the lesser gods, this was a frontal attack on the main god. It was like saying to all of Egypt, "Your most powerful god cannot even light a candle before my power." Meanwhile, Exodus records the contrast. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. In Goshen, it was day. Children played, families cooked, life went on. While all of Egypt lay paralyzed in the deepest darkness it had ever experienced, the Hebrews lived in broad daylight. The message was impossible to ignore, even for the most obstinate observer. When the darkness finally dissipated, Pharaoh called Moses one last time, and he made a final offer. Exodus 10:24. Go, worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go with you. Only leave your flocks and herds behind. Moses refused. Not a hoof is to be left behind. And Pharaoh lost control. Exodus 10:28. Pharaoh said to Moses, "Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die." And Moses replied, "Just as you say, I will never appear before you again." And it was Pharaoh who signed the death sentence of his own children, because the 10th plague, the last, the definitive one, the one that changed everything, had already been decreed. And this time, there was no negotiation. There was no warning of Pharaoh to harden his heart and then retreat. The cycle was over. God said to Moses in Exodus 11:4-5, "About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. Every firstborn, from the palace to the slave quarters, from the throne to the mill. It did not matter if you were rich or poor, noble or slave, powerful or insignificant. If you were the first son, you would die that night." Exodus 11:6 adds, "There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again." But before that night arrived, God gave instructions to the Hebrews that defined the most important ritual in the history of Israel, and that echo to this day, more than 3,000 years later. Each family was to take a lamb without defect, a year-old male. They were to keep it for 4 days. Imagine living with the animal, feeding it, seeing it as a living creature, and then, on the 14th day of the month, slaughter it at twilight. Take the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the doorframes of the house. And that night, when the destroyer passed through Egypt, he would see the blood and pass over. Hence the name Pesach, Passover. The Lord passed over. The meal had specific instructions. Roast the lamb whole, not boiled in water, roasted over the fire. Eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Eat it standing up, with your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, in haste, like someone who is about to flee, because that was exactly what they were about to do. And then midnight came. Exodus 12:29-30. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. There was not a house without someone dead. Read that again. Every Egyptian house had at least one death that night. In a nation of millions, every family lost someone, the eldest son, the heir, the father's pride. Pharaoh's own firstborn died. The boy who was the future of the throne, the next living god of Egypt, died like any other. Imagine the sound of that night. It was not crying. It was a collective howl of millions of people discovering all at once that their children were dead. The text says loud wailing. The Hebrew uses se'aka gedola, a cry of agony so deep that the same word is used to describe the cry of the Hebrews under slavery. The cry that rose from Egypt that night must have been audible miles away. And it was at that moment, on that night, at that hour, with the body of his own son still warm, that Pharaoh finally broke. Exodus 12:31-32. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and go, and also bless me." That last detail is devastating, and also bless me. The man who said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" now begged for the blessing of the God he refused to recognize. It was no longer arrogance. It was a broken father, holding his son's body, begging for mercy from the God he challenged 10 times. And the Egyptians, Exodus 12:33, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. They did not just allow the Hebrews to leave, they pushed them out. With urgency, with desperation, fearing that if they stayed one more day, the next plague would annihilate them completely. And verses 35-36, the Hebrews asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, and the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. The Egyptians handed over their wealth voluntarily. Everything, anything. Take what you want, but just go. After generations of slavery, the Hebrews left Egypt loaded with gold, and Egypt was left behind, on its knees, burying its children. And now I need you to visualize what happened in the following hours, because the Exodus itself, the physical act of leaving Egypt, was a logistical event of almost unimaginable proportions. Exodus says they set out from Ramesses towards Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. 600,000 adult men. If you add women, children, and the elderly, estimates range between 2 and 3 million people. Even if the numbers are interpreted more conservatively, and there is legitimate academic debate about the translation of the Hebrew word elef, which can mean thousand or clan. We are talking, at the very least, about tens of thousands of people setting in motion at the same time. At night, in the dark, with children in their arms, flocks by their side, bags of unleavened dough on their backs. Exodus details this moment with almost cinematic domestic precision. The people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. They left so fast that the bread did not have time to rise. The raw dough was wrapped in the wooden troughs themselves, tied in cloth, thrown on their backs, and they ran. That is where unleavened bread, matzah, which Jews eat at Passover to this day, comes from. It's not an abstract symbol. It's the physical memory of a flight so urgent there was no time to wait for the dough to ferment. And along with the Hebrews, a crowd went out that is often ignored in traditional narratives. Exodus 12:38. Many other people went up with them. The Hebrew uses erev rav, a great mixture. They were Egyptians, slaves of other nationalities, Semitic peoples living in the Delta, people who saw the plagues, who saw the power of the God of Israel, and who decided on that night of terror that it was better to follow the Hebrews than to stay in Egypt. The Exodus was not just an ethnic liberation, it was a civilizational rupture. People of multiple origins, abandoning a collapsing empire to follow a God who had just proven 10 consecutive times that he was more powerful than any other force in the known world. Think of the road that night, a human column stretching for miles. The crying of babies, the lowing of oxen, the clinking of Egyptian gold and silver inside the bags. Torches illuminating exhausted but determined faces. Behind them, the distant sound of Egypt in mourning, that collective cry. that did not cease, and in front of them, the desert. No one knew exactly where they were going. Moses knew the general direction. Canaan, the promised land, but the route, the logistics, what to eat when supplies ran out, how to provide water to millions of people in the Sinai desert. None of that was resolved. They were marching on pure faith, following an 80-year-old man who had spoken to God in a bush 40 years earlier. And God guided them in a way that the text describes as visible, tangible, impossible to ignore. Exodus 13:21. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. A pillar of cloud during the day, a pillar of fire during the night, visible to everyone. It was not blind faith. It was following a supernatural manifestation, hovering on the horizon, moving when they should move, stopping when they should stop. The text adds something that reveals the intensity of that march, by day or night. They did not stop to rest. They did not set up camp on the first night. They kept marching, day and night, because they all knew instinctively that Pharaoh could change his mind. He had already done it 9 times before. Why would he not do it again? And they were right. It is impressive how the biblical text does not try to soften what happened next. It does not turn Pharaoh into a cartoonish villain or a tragic hero. It just records the facts with an almost cold honesty. Exodus 14:5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." Notice, it was not just Pharaoh, it was the officials too. The same officials who, days before, confronted Pharaoh and said, "Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" now said, "Why did we let them go?" The pain of the firstborn was still fresh, the graves were still recent, and even so the collective thought turned to, "We need them back." Not out of pride, out of necessity, because without the Hebrew slaves, who would rebuild Egypt? Who would work in the devastated fields? Who would mold the bricks, carry the stones, raise what the plagues destroyed? Egypt had just lost its crops, its herds, its firstborn, and now its workforce too. It was complete ruin. And Pharaoh, in that desperate calculation between grief and the survival of his kingdom, chose persecution. Exodus 14:6-7. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. 600 elite war chariots, plus the entire available fleet. The Egyptian war chariot was the most advanced military technology of the Bronze Age. A light wooden platform pulled by 2 horses, carrying a driver and an archer. In open field, against a disorganized mass of civilians, it was an almost unstoppable killing machine. Each chariot could reach speeds that no human on foot could match, and Pharaoh brought hundreds of them against families with children. The image is that of a professional army mobilized to hunt refugees. And the Hebrews, they were trapped. God had guided them by a specific route, not by the shortest path, which passed through the land of the Philistines, but by a detour that led them directly to the edge of the sea. Exodus 14:2 gives the coordinates. Encamp near Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-Zephon. The exact location is debated by archaeologists to this day. It could be the Gulf of Suez. It could be the Bitter Lakes region. It could be another point in the lake system that separated Egypt from the Sinai. But the geographical effect was clear. The Hebrews had the sea in front of them and no escape route to the sides. And then they looked back and saw the dust on the horizon, the chariots, the army, Pharaoh coming after them with all the fury of a man who lost his son and wanted to compensate for that loss with blood. Panic was immediate. Exodus 14:10-12 records the people's reaction with a rawness that almost hurts to read. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." This is one of the most human speeches in the entire Bible. It's not a lack of faith, it's genuine terror. These are fathers and mothers looking at their children, looking at the sea they cannot cross, looking at the approaching chariots and thinking, "I'm going to see my children die here." And the sarcasm, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt?" is the voice of people who felt a flash of hope for the first time in generations, only to see it crushed on the third day of freedom. The bitterness of this sarcasm is the exact measure of the hope they had dared to feel. You only get that bitter when the thing you lost was too precious. And Moses' response is one of the most extraordinary declarations ever recorded in any ancient text. Exodus 14:13-14, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Do not be afraid. Stand still. Just watch. The Lord will fight for you, and all you need to do is keep silent." Imagine hearing that with the sound of horses approaching, with the dust of the chariots already visible, with your children clutching your leg, crying, an 80-year-old man saying, "Do nothing, just watch." This was the faith of Moses, or perhaps more accurately, this was the faith of someone who had already seen a bush burn without being consumed, a staff turn into a snake, a river turn to blood, and 10 impossible plagues devastate the most powerful nation in the world. Moses was not asking the people to believe in the abstract. He was saying, "You saw what God did in Egypt. Why do you think he would bring you here to die?" And then God gave Moses the most famous instruction in all of the Old Testament, Exodus 14:16. "Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." And the pillar of cloud that went before the people moved. It went behind, positioning itself between the Hebrew camp and the Egyptian army. Exodus describes the effect. For the Egyptians, it was darkness. For the Israelites, it was light. The same cloud was darkness on one side and illumination on the other. The Egyptian army, the most powerful on earth, was stopped in its tracks, not by walls, not by another army, but by a wall of supernatural darkness that simply did not allow advancement. And while the Egyptian soldiers waited in the dark, unable to see what was happening on the other side, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. Exodus 14:21. All that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided all night. It was not instantaneous. A violent wind blew from the east for hours, pushing the waters, exposing the seabed, drying the ground so it would be passable. And when the sun rose, the Hebrews looked forward and saw the impossible. A corridor of dry land cutting through the sea, with walls of water on both sides. Exodus 14:22. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Stop and visualize that. You are walking on an exposed seabed. The ground under your feet is still damp, but firm enough to walk on. On both sides, walls of water rise, not frozen waves, but liquid masses held in place by a force that defies everything you know about how water works. You can see fish, seaweed, the dark depth of the sea beyond the surface, and you walk with your children, with your animals, with your unleavened dough on your back and the Egyptian gold in your bags. You walk through a corridor that should not exist, in a sea that should have swallowed you, toward a shore that hours before was inaccessible. The 2 or 3 million, or even tens of thousands in the most conservative estimate, needed hours to cross. The human column was immense. The maritime corridor, however wide it was, created a bottleneck. families carrying everything they owned, reluctant flocks that had to be pulled, the elderly who could not walk fast, children who stopped to look at the walls of water with wide eyes. And all this time, the pillar of cloud kept the Egyptians in darkness, prevented from advancing. But then, as the last Hebrews were reaching the other shore, the cloud moved. The Egyptians saw the corridor, and they did exactly what any trained army would do. They pursued. Exodus 14:23. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. 600 elite chariots plus the entire cavalry entered the seabed. Wooden wheels on compacted mud. Horses trained for war, but never for that. The surface that had been firm for pedestrians began to give way under the weight of the chariots. Exodus 14:25. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficult driving. The wheels got stuck. They broke. The chariots, the most lethal weapon of the ancient world, became traps. Horses reared, soldiers fell into the mud, officers shouted orders that no one could carry out. And in that moment of chaos, of panic, of total impotence, the Egyptians understood. Exodus 14:25. They said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Too late. Exodus 14:26-28. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Not one of them survived. Not a soldier was left. Not a horse was left. Not a chariot was left. The most powerful army of the ancient world was swallowed in minutes. The water that had been a wall became a tomb. The chariots that had been the vanguard of military technology became anchors that dragged their occupants to the bottom. And on the opposite shore, the Hebrews watched. Exodus 14:30-31. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. They saw the bodies. The tide brought the corpses, the pieces of armor, the wreckage of the chariots. The same soldiers who, hours before, were the incarnation of Egyptian terror, now lay on the sand like debris. And it was at that moment, there, on that beach with the wet sand under their feet and the remains of the enemy army floating in the water, that the people of Israel understood, truly, for the first time, what had happened. They were no longer slaves. They would not be pursued again. Egypt could no longer reach them. The whip, the brick, the production quota, the sun thrown into the river, all of that stayed on the other side of a sea that opened and closed like a door. And they sang. Exodus 15 records the Song of Moses, the oldest war hymn preserved in text, and many scholars consider it one of the oldest passages in the entire Hebrew Bible, possibly composed at the very moment it describes. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. And Miriam, Moses' sister, the same girl who decades before stood watching the papyrus basket in the Nile to protect her baby brother, took a timbrel and led the women in dancing and singing. The girl who watched the river now danced on the shore of the sea. History had come full circle, but now I need us to go back and look at the other side of this story. Because what happened to Egypt after the Exodus is something that is rarely discussed, and it is as important as the liberation itself. Imagine Egypt the next morning. No army, no functional pharaoh. Whether he died in the sea or stayed on the shore is debated, but in any scenario, his authority was destroyed. No firstborn, no slaves, no crops, no herds, no flax for clothes or bandages, without most of the fleet of war chariots. A civilization that weeks before was the incontestable superpower of the ancient world was now operating at the most basic survival level. The remaining granaries would become the only resource between the population and mass starvation. The redistribution of food, without pack animals, without intact naval infrastructure, without sufficient labor, was a logistical problem that would test any modern government, let alone a collapsing ancient bureaucracy. The temples, which were the administrative, religious, and economic center of every city, lost their theological credibility. Their gods had been publicly defeated, one by one. Ra, the supreme god, could not prevent 3 days of darkness. Hapi did not protect the Nile. Heket did not prevent the frogs from becoming a plague instead of a blessing. What sense did it make to offer sacrifices to gods who demonstrated before the entire nation that they were powerless? And this is the dimension that transforms the Exodus from a story of liberation into something much greater. It was not just a people escaping slavery. It was the complete and systematic dismantling of an entire worldview. Egypt did not just lose labor and wealth, it lost the metaphysical foundation upon which its entire civilization was built. If the gods are not real, the Pharaoh is not divine. If the Pharaoh is not divine, his authority is not legitimate. If his authority is not legitimate, the entire hierarchical structure that sustained society, from priests to scribes, from governors to tax collectors, has no reason to exist. The plagues did not just destroy Egypt's economy, they destroyed Egypt's theology. And without theology, ancient Egypt had no state because the Egyptian state was, in its essence, a theocracy. Every law, every tax, every construction, every war was justified by the will of the gods and the divinity of the Pharaoh. Take that away, and you have a nation without a narrative, without identity, without a reason to obey. And for the Hebrews, what began on that night of blood on the doorframes and unleavened bread on their backs became the founding event of an entire nation. Everything in Israel, the law, the identity, the relationship with God, the collective memory, goes back to the Exodus. When God presents himself at Sinai to give the 10 Commandments, he does not say, "I am the Lord who created the heavens and the earth." He says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." The identity of God for Israel was linked to the Exodus before anything else. And to this day, more than 3,000 years later, every spring, Jewish families around the world sit at the Seder table, eat unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and retell the story. Father to son, mother to daughter, generation after generation. The ritual that began that night in Egypt, with blood on the doorframes and sandals on their feet, has never stopped being celebrated. There is no older continuous tradition in human civilization. And every time the matzah is broken and the story is retold, something extraordinary happens. The distance between that night and this night disappears. The Haggadah, the text read at the Seder, instructs each participant to see themselves as if they themselves had come out of Egypt, not their ancestors, them personally. On that night, every Jew is a slave who has just been set free. Every piece of unleavened bread is the dough that did not have time to rise. Every bitter herb is the taste of slavery. And every cup of wine is the celebration of a God who heard the cry of his people and came down to rescue them. If you have made it this far, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I prepared it, especially for those who watch this one until the end.